Okay, so we left off last week after the German invasion of Poland, and if you recall that the Russians came in from the other side in the middle of September, and now they began moving against the Jews that they had in Poland. And a lot of it had to do, a lot of the Polish reaction was because of what was perceived as happening in the Russian sector. So when the Russians showed up, a lot of the people were very happy, especially the Jews, because they felt that the communists would be better to them. Turns out it was actually not that way. They ended up moving against all their religious organizations after a time. But that was the original feeling that the Jews had. The Poles got angry because they perceived that the NKVD, which became the KGB, was dominated all by Jews. So they thought that, everybody thought that the Jews were taking revenge on the Poles, and they were basically getting the Poles even angrier. So when a courier named Jan Karski, he wrote a report for the government, the Polish government in exile in England, and what he said was, although the nation loathes the Germans, the Jewish question is a narrow bridge upon which they find agreement. Virtually all Poles are bitter and disappointed with regard to the Jews. The overwhelming majority literally look forward to an opportunity for a repayment in blood. So the Poles, their anti-Semitism was inflamed further. So there, in Dr. Friedlander's book, he cites two reports about whether there were actually more Jews than normal in the NKVD or the KGB, and one says yes and one says no. So I would assume that there were definitely some, and that's really what people picked up on. But again, that perception really changed, or more exacerbated. It didn't really change the original Polish feeling, but it exacerbated Polish feelings toward the Jews. And they were not helped by the fact that the government in exile had anti-Semites in it also. For example, a man named Roman Knoll was actually appointed by the Polish government in exile to liaison with the Home Army, which was the Polish underground. So they were the guys that would carry out sabotage, and so they were essentially the Polish resistance. And what he said was, there is no choice between Zionism and the former state of affairs, but rather Zionism or extermination. Okay, so here you have Poles saying that they think that in this war we can't just have Jews in Poland anymore, we need to get rid of them, or we'll be taken over. Okay? So this is really, the Jews had no friends anywhere. In the Russian part of the country, they thought that it would be better for them. It turned out the Russians moved against them quickly. And we know already what the Germans were doing to them. But now it's also compounded by the fact that they have no help from any of the Poles. So there's an apocryphal story that there were two trains at the border. One is going east filled with Jews, and one's going west filled with Jews. And they stop at a border train station, and each one looks at the other and says, "You're mad, where are you going?" Okay, so just as many people that went, a writer has mentioned this story, how long ago was that? He mentioned that a while ago, but about how there were a lot of people that went from the Russian side to the German side because they thought it would be better.
Yeah, it's true. In other words, people didn't know. I mean, the Germans were not, historically, the Russians had a much longer history of anti-Semitism. So there were people who crossed the border both ways. It was a time of great indecision.
Yeah, so really, Jews in Poland were extremely confused. And with regard to whether Germans in Germany knew what was going on, we can say that due to soldiers returning home and tourists, people would go and view the ghetto to feel good about themselves, I guess. We see in the diary of opposition leaders that they wrote about how they heard about Jewish repression of Jews that was going on in Poland. But what they said was that after they got rid of Nazi Germany, they also didn't want any Jews. They only wanted Jews that could prove that they had been in Germany for hundreds of years. Okay? So even the people that wanted to get rid of Hitler in Germany also had no love lost for the Jews. Okay? So that's where we are in Poland. So what was happening during the winter? Was there more fighting during the winter? No. What was it called?
The fake war.
Yeah.
Time out.
Phony war. Time out, yeah. So the war was called Blitzkrieg, so the interlude was called Sitzkrieg, which means phony war or fake war. Okay? The first British soldier was not killed until December 9th. Okay, so that's a gap of 2.5 months. You would think that nations at war, that would happen a little quicker. So I just thought I would point out here the difference between that and, I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the War of Attrition, but after the Yom Kippur War in 1973, I hope you all knew it was in 1973, along the Egyptian-Israeli border, they would actually really have artillery and tank duels all the time, and people would get killed. But it was almost an undeclared war, because they weren't actively, right? They didn't each declare war and start fighting each other. They were just actually fighting. So this is exactly the opposite. They declared war, but they weren't fighting. Okay? So I just figured I'd bring up some Israeli history once we're here already. So the only place where there actually was fighting was Russia invaded Finland in December of 1939 because they wanted to get part of the Karelian Peninsula, I believe. And Russia did an extremely bad job. Their soldiers were ill-equipped, they were ill-trained. The Finns actually made them suffer, but eventually, right, just due to the fact that they had so many soldiers, they were able to win. They didn't completely conquer Finland, they only conquered a part of it. But this did a couple things. It lowered the German opinion of the Russian army, okay, which is going to be very important because even though, as we've seen historically, there's a great German fear about a two-front war and having to fight on both sides at the same time. However, since the Germans thought that the Russians had a very bad army and were extremely weak, they thought that this wouldn't be a problem, and that allowed them to invade Russia without having conquered Britain, which would eventually lead to their downfall. Okay? So, what was the next country to be invaded by Germany after Poland? It's in Europe. No. No? Yes, Denmark. Yeah. So on April 9th, they occupied Denmark and Norway at the same time. But Denmark they conquered right away. They really conquered it in a couple hours. They landed paratroopers, and that was pretty much it. In Norway, actually, that was the first time that the British actually fought them. The British sent a whole task force, and they fought, but the Germans won. And the reason why they went for Scandinavia first is because we've talked about Germany doesn't have a lot of raw materials, right? We talked about it. That's part of why they signed the non-aggression treaty with Russia, so that they could get Russian raw materials. But that actually is really the entire reasoning behind Lebensraum, the theory, Hitler's theory about living space to the east. The real place that he wants with that is the Ukraine, because the Ukraine is the seat of what? No, that's more wheat. Eventually he wants the Caucasus, which is in Russia. That's where they went for oil. They also went to Romania for oil. That would actually be their most important place for oil, would be Romania and Ploesti. The Americans would bomb that constantly over and over and over again because they felt that was extremely important. But even, for example, have any of you ever heard of Primo Levi? What did Primo Levi write?
A book.
That's correct. Wrote a book about his experiences in Auschwitz. And he did not Okay, so when people think of Auschwitz, what do you think about Auschwitz? How many camps were there in Auschwitz?
6 main, 2?
There were 3 main ones. There were like 50 or... There were a lot of satellites, but there was Auschwitz 1. Okay, there was Auschwitz-Birkenau, was where the gas chambers were, or most of the gas chambers were. There was a gas chamber in Auschwitz 1. And the third one is Buna, or Monowitz. Okay, and that's where Primo Levi worked, and he wrote his book about his experiences there. I have it at home, and I suddenly blanked on what the title was. I don't know why. Anyway, this Buna factory manufactured synthetic oil and rubber. Okay? And a lot of what the Germans did in World War I and II is they tried to come up with synthetic ways to write margarine, right, which is a substitute for butter. What? You mean it's I don't know exactly how you make margarine, but margarine is a substitute for butter, right? Okay. They also came up with synthetic for explosives. They came up with nitrates, like synthetic nitrates. So the Germans had to be very, very crafty. What? Yeah, they had to be very creative because they had an extreme lack of raw materials. Okay, so that's why they invaded Scandinavia, because their main source of iron ore was Sweden. And if they lost that, if the British would cut off Norway, which is where it came through, they would have had they would have none of these. They wouldn't be able to make tanks. They wouldn't be able to make anything with iron or steel. Actually, I'm getting off on a tangent, but there were ball bearings that they would make that would be part of their tanks and planes, and the Americans bombed the factory and almost completely destroyed it. Then they stopped bombing it and started bombing other places. And Albert Speer, who was Minister of Armaments at that point in time, said if they would have kept bombing those couple of factories, they would have ended the war a year or 2 earlier. Okay? So the fact that they just started carpet bombing everything and they started bombing cities as opposed to just specific manufactured products that the German army couldn't live without actually extended the war and did a disservice. Just something to think about. Okay, so the next... Yeah? What? Yeah, but he ran the entire... So he was in charge of the armaments industry. So I would say that he would have a pretty good idea of that. Also, other people have said that also. I just think he's most persuasive because he actually knew what was happening. Okay, so somebody mentioned that the next country invaded was France. So what day did Germany invade France?
Wednesday. 1812. September 31st.
Gave the month.
July 10th.
No, 10th of January 6th. June 6th is D-Day. No, May 10th, 1940. You were close. Yes, you were very close enough. Okay, so again, the Germans here used a very ingenious plan, because what did the French build after World War I? To protect themselves. What?
Maginot.
Yeah, Maginot. Yeah. Okay. So, what? So it essentially, the French thought the next war would be the same kind of war as World War I. So they built massive fortifications on the border between France and Germany. It actually didn't even extend all the way to the sea because the Belgians wouldn't let them build it there. But they thought that they would be able to block Germany. Germany would, when they would try and get over the wall, essentially they wouldn't be able to get through it because of how strong the fortifications were. Okay, what they did not anticipate was they went through the forest instead. There's a forest called the Ardennes Forest. Have you ever heard of it before?
Yeah.
It's also the place where they fought the Battle of the Bulge in 1944, where the Americans thought they wouldn't go again. But there's actually only one road big enough for tanks in the Ardennes. They used it. So they didn't protect the forest, so the Germans just went behind it. They just went behind the entire wall. And so there was basically nothing that the French could do, because they were behind them already. So how long did it take for France to fall?
6 weeks.
6 weeks. 6 weeks. Very close. Yeah, 6 weeks. Okay? But, there's something significant that they did not do, that they allowed to happen at the end of the battle, that greatly contributed to them not. Yeah? You know already? What? How many British soldiers were allowed to escape from France?
Like a whole bunch. Like a
Yeah. Yes, a whole bunch, exactly. Yeah, you're close. 330,000. Right? And that's because of Dunkirk. Right? Heard of Dunkirk? Yes, the miracle at Dunkirk. Okay? There are many theories for why the Germans stopped. Yeah, what's your theory? Okay, so essentially, remember we talked about how the Germans would go around, right? They'd surround the enemy forces and just close the Vise. So what they did here was they used the sea as the back, and they just started pushing the British soldiers closer and closer to the sea. Okay? But Hitler ordered the tanks to stop. There are a couple of theories. One is that Göring said that he wanted the Luftwaffe to do it without the tanks. So he thought that just you stay out here, we'll just bomb them, we'll kill all of them. Okay? But I mean, if you have the miracle of Dunkirk, it's quite fascinating. Basically, the British mobilized not just their navy, but basically anything that could float, like sailboats and yachts, everything that could float. And they went over and they took anybody they could. They went back and forth. And if you think about it, 330,000 guys is a lot.
How long did it take them?
I think it was 9 days, 10 days. It was 24 hours. It was around the clock, and they had to deal with artillery, they had to deal with tanks, they had to deal with bombing. Yeah. So that was actually, there were larger fighter battles fought at Dunkirk than I think during the Battle of Britain, I believe.
Very interesting. If it took them, how would it take 9 days to move 300,000 people? How would it be that the CS strike happened one night and like 3 million people?
What happened one night?
The CS strike.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to compare miracle.
They weren't going to boats.
Yeah, all they would walk.
Right. Yes. Though it would take a while for 3 million people to walk. That's 600,000. Well, it's 600,000 between 20 and 60, right? So you have to think of boys and older men. And then yes, it is quite miraculous. I think we've established Jesus' reign was quite the miracle. Okay, so the invasion of France caused who to be removed as the British Prime Minister? Want somebody else to remember? Yes, Neville Chamberlain, and he was replaced by who?
Winston Churchill.
Yes. So that was on May 10th. Okay. So the invasion of France was the final straw. Okay. And something else happened upon the invasion of France, though not right at the beginning. The Italians entered the war. They entered the war on June 10th. What? Yeah. They entered the war on June 10th, which was basically a week before France was entirely gone. Yeah, so they waited till the last minute so that they could go into southwestern France. What? Who cares? It actually worked out. Oh, yeah. Well, essentially.
When did it happen that when German went check out the Italian Air Force, did we already cover that?
What do you mean?
When Germany went to check Italy's Air Force, they just brought them back or something. Did that ever happen?
Yeah.
Well, so when Hitler asked Mussolini to declare war, Mussolini basically wrote back with a shopping list and said, "We can't go to war unless you give us all of this," which essentially all the things he asked for were basically impossible. So he essentially wormed out of it. He said, "I would love to fight, but our army, we need 2 million tons of coal and 2 million of this and 1 million of that." So I mean, if that's what you're saying, something of that nature. They never necessarily checked out. They didn't go to Italy and check
Hitler
out.
never visited.
He did, but he visited in the not early 30s, like 1936, I think, 1937. And again, I mean, they held military parades for him, but I don't really think you're able to tell. I mean, I'm sure they had some idea that they didn't know the Italians were as bad as they would be, if that's what you're asking, right? So the two times that that Mussolini did something on his own, he messed Hitler over, right? In North Africa, they lost, right? Well, no, they lost to the British. That's why Rommel went. The Italians were there by themselves. They had a lot more guys than the British, and they lost quite terribly. So then Rommel went, and then Rommel fought back. Okay, so that was that. Also in Greece, he invaded Albania and Greece without telling Hitler, and then they also started losing terribly, and they had to go in again. So it didn't end up working out for them. Also in Russia, when they started using non-German soldiers, that was usually where the Russians would break through and surround the German guys. So there.
Who do they use then?
What?
Who do they use if not German?
Well, they used Italians, Hungarians, Romanians, people who were allies with them. Okay, so the country was split in two. Okay, the northern half was administered by the Germans, and the southern half was administered by the French under the name of Vichy, which is a town in southern France. Okay, so again, we talked about the Battle of Britain. Germany did not, at this point in time, they could have invaded Britain, but they did not, for a couple of reasons. One, they weren't really trained to make waterborne landings. They were also very afraid of the British Navy, because the Germans didn't have a particularly good navy. What? So they were afraid of that. They also were afraid of the British fighters, which is why they fought the Battle of Britain. Okay, but why were the British? The British had a device that really was used for the first time. Yes, radar. Exactly. So they were able to use smaller forces, but they were able to direct them to the right place. So that's how they survived. And the truth is that Hitler didn't want to bomb London right away. They wanted to avoid bombing civilian places. No, I guess to avoid having to deal with bombing of Germany. Also, what did Göring say you could call him if Britain would bomb Berlin? No. It's a Jewish name. He said if any bomb falls on Berlin, you can call me Meyer or Mayor. Sorry, Mayor.
So nice.
Listen, he said it, not me. Okay, so that the first time they bombed London was they actually did it by mistake. One plane got lost, but then the British bombed Germany, and then so they started the Blitz, which is what the Battle of Britain eventually is famous for. But it really started as just fighters bombing each other, fighting each other. But the Germans lost that battle. Okay, so all this time, what's happening with the Jews? So Hitler, in public, actually was making only desultory mention to the Jews. Okay, so in his speeches, really, he would say international Jewish capitalist, but he didn't necessarily recount his prophecy of January 30th, 1939, that if war came, he would kill all the Jews. He's not mentioning that now. Okay, so he's really not mentioning that at all. However, internally, Himmler wrote a memorandum on the resettlement of the Jews. Okay? What he said was that the ethnic mush would be transported to the general government. Okay? So you have ethnic mush that the Germans now control, while the Jews will be moved to Africa or some colony, because the reason why we can't kill them is because physical extermination is Bolshevik and un-German. Okay, so you have ethnic mush, and then you have Jews, and we can't kill them because that's un-German. Okay, so at this point in time, right, Hitler still thinks that they can move them somewhere. Where did he want to move them?
Madagascar.
Right, wanted to move them to Madagascar. What the what members of the German government said was that not that these Jews, we just moved them there, it's not the only reason. They would also stay in German hands. The reason would be that the Germans would remain in German hands as a pledge for the good conduct of the Jews in America. So the Germans had this really interesting... What? Essentially, yes. First of all, they had... Hitler really didn't know much about the United States. I think that would color a lot of things. They didn't really have any knowledge about how the United States worked. And two, they also had a lot of misinformation of how integrated Jewish communities actually were. We're going to see shortly, it's much worse than you think probably, but I'm not sure that necessarily would have dissuaded all the Jews of America in the sense that the Germans thought. So the Germans tried to get Jews to leave until October 1940, because then Heydrich realized what he said was specifically with regards to Jews in Poland. The migration of Eastern Jews means a continual spiritual regeneration of world Jewry, as these Jews, due to their orthodox religious attitudes, represent a large part of rabbis, Talmudic teachers, etc., who are in demand, particularly to Jewish organizations active in the United States. Okay? So, just throwing that out there, I don't necessarily know how to look at this per se, because again, they did go tirelessly after non-Orthodox as well as Orthodox Jews, but it seems that there was a slightly different way that they dealt with Eastern versus Western Jews, and I'm not sure if that's because they viewed, because I would say Poland had a much larger proportion of them were Orthodox or visibly religious as opposed to Western Jews, and that angered them more, or it's just because the Eastern European attitude versus Western European attitude, they thought the Western Europeans would react much worse if they treated the Jews as bad in Western Europe as they did in Eastern Europe, because they treated them rather brutally. I mean, obviously brutally, but even when they were deporting them, it was much more brutal than it was in Western Europe. So I'm not exactly sure why that would be, but those are two possibilities. Could be both are true. They're not necessarily exclusive, right? So where would these Jews want to emigrate? So one would think it would be the United States, but that was virtually impossible. This was because
isolation.
Yeah. Also, the State Department was remarkably anti-Semitic, particularly Breckinridge Long, who was the Assistant Secretary of State. What he said was his goal was to indefinitely delay and effectively stop immigration. Because he did this, he put in an order to American consuls, so people in American embassies, said what he wanted them to do was to put every obstacle in the way to postpone and postpone and postpone the granting of visas. That's an actual quote. Okay, so not only postpone once. Okay, so he really tried to make sure that no Jews would be given visas. He also, in 1942 and 1943, when the Americans knew the type of that the exterminations were going on, he specifically worked to frustrate all rescue efforts that the United States engaged in. Okay? So they had to deal with a remarkably anti-Semitic State Department. They also had to deal with the fact that Roosevelt really didn't act until it was politically expedient. Okay? The Jewish leaders were harassing him long before he actually acted, and this, I think, and just based on what I've read, is because he didn't have to. There was nothing really for him to gain by helping the Jews any earlier than he did, so he just decided, why risk political capital to help the Jews? Okay? But he was also helped by the fact that American Jewish leaders let him do that. For example, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who, I just looked it up, he was, I think, the leader of the Reformed congregation in the United States. I think he was also the president or head of the American Jewish Congress. Well, he said, this is in a private letter, but he said, cruel as I may seem, which is Roosevelt, his re-election is much more important for everything that is worthwhile and that counts, rather than the admission of a few people, however imminent their peril. Okay? So he basically said Roosevelt is more important than us saving however many Jews we can. And that would continue. They would defer to Roosevelt again and again and again, and they would let him off the hook, so he didn't do anything, because he didn't have to, until it was far too late.
Did they know how many there were that were
you mean in terms of how many they could actually have helped? Probably a lot less. I don't think they would have really been able to save a lot of the Jews in Poland, because probably not. I'll just mention. So the only ways they could get out was they could illegally emigrate to Palestine, which caused a lot of problems. We'll talk about how the British looked at that. There was a semi-legal way, which is that they could smuggle themselves over the Spanish or Portuguese borders, but the Spanish and Portuguese were not particularly willing to accept them either. Or you could go through Russia to Shanghai and try and get to... Basically, the end goal was to get into the Western Hemisphere. So if the U.S. if they would have been, I guess, a little more accepting, if they would have had more visas, perhaps more Jews could have found transit before 1941. I think after 1941 probably would have been a moot issue, just because most of the Jews were already in German hands, and I think by 1941, especially when they invaded Russia, I would say that they weren't really letting the Jews. They didn't want to let the Jews get away anymore. At that point in time, they were going to kill them. Okay. So you would think that with this being the case, it might just be that the Americans don't want to let in any refugees of any color whatsoever, right? However, in August 1940, Congress passed a law that allowed British children to emigrate to the United States in numbers far above quotas, and Roosevelt did this by using a loophole by calling them visitors. And apparently if you call them visitors, you don't have to get rid of them. Okay? They never used that for Jews. They only used that for British kids. Okay? So, draw what I think is the only obvious conclusion is that they helped the Jews. Okay? Which also, all these things make it very interesting. Say the Jewish obsession with voting Democrat in the United States is really based on Roosevelt. Is based on Jewish love for Roosevelt. But the truth is that the more you look at it, he was no savior of the Jews at all. So I'm not quite sure what that deal would be. But that is the fact. So again, we mentioned that they were trying to illegally emigrate into Palestine, which evoked negative reactions from Britain. Actually, at the start of the war, the foreign secretary for the British was Jewish, but they made him resign because they ended up saying that to have a Jew in charge of our propaganda or our outward policy would be unfathomable, because of course he's a Jew, so he's going to sabotage. They didn't say, of course, because he's a Jew, but that would be the inference. Huh? You would think, yeah. So, and especially, again, in the colonial office, which supervised immigration, okay, the quote of a man named Sir John Shuckburgh, he said, "I am convinced they hate us and have always hated us," right, the Jews. "They hate all Gentiles." So what they decided, right, remember we talked about how they deported Jews to Cyprus? I believe That might have been after the war. What they decided during the war was that they would deport all the Jews they caught to Mauritius.
No, so
Where is Mauritius?
yeah.
It's further than Madagascar.
Near Africa somewhere.
Australia.
It's closer to Australia. It's an island in the Indian Ocean.
Chain of islands.
There are many chains of islands there. I actually think Mauritius is a big island by itself, but there are chains of islands. That's where the Americans predominantly fought the Japanese, were basically the chains of islands in the Pacific. If you're actually interested.
Okay. No, I was.
So the Solomons, the Marshalls.
Chains of islands or names of people?
No, these are the names of chains of islands.
Oh.
I believe they originally derived from names of people.
Okay.
But the Philippines is also, it's not one island. The Philippines is like 100 islands, even more than that. Right.
Everybody.
What? Yeah? Yeah. I thought there were a lot more. But anyway, so that's predominantly what happened in the Pacific. Okay. Meanwhile, through all this, the Jews were confined to ghettos, right? We mentioned when that happened. But on May 19th, the Lodz ghetto, the Jews were placed in the most rundown segment of the town, and that part of the town was surrounded by a no man's land, so they couldn't actually get out. Okay? How many people were in the Lodz ghetto? Not really expecting you to know this.
8 million.
100,000.
163,000. How many square miles was the ghetto?
4,000.
Actually, it's really 6,000. But now comes the closest. Yes! 1.54 square miles.
What did he say? That's one.
Okay?
No, come on.
No board marker.
He said 2.2.
Yeah, one closer.
No, I think it'd be interesting to do the math. How many feet in a mile?
I'm really good at that.
5,000.
Are you seriously don't know how many feet are in a mile?
No.
So how many feet are in a mile?
10. Come on, so let's go.
Michelle, come on. You don't know?
You don't get
5,208.
That's what I said.
You said 5,700. Anyway, okay. So, silence. All right. Listen. Okay, so you have 8,000 square feet. You have, there's no that would work it out. You have 163,000 people and 8,000 square feet. How many square feet per person? Do it. I know how much it is. I worked it out before. Okay. How much is 16 divided by 8? Okay. 4. So, if you end up doing the math, I just wanted to point out, just to see whether you guys know math. It works out to 20.3 square feet per person, which is 4 by 5 feet. Okay? So that's basically that by that. That's how much you had.
Tilt the camera to show.
Okay? That's how much you had.
No.
All right?
So much they have.
Huh?
understand. It's like a puzzle board.
No, it's much, much less.
Like the side, I meant the corkboard.
Oh. Yeah, that's probably closer. Yeah. Okay? I apologize. Okay. So, what? That's true. All right. So now, the Jews were very confined. But do they have any modern amenities? I'm about to go through it with you. Okay? So, they weren't allowed to use electricity at night, actually.
That's 2.
Okay, there were 613 apartments in the Lodz ghetto with drains. Only 382 with water pipes and drains. Only 294 with a toilet. Only 49 with a toilet, drain, and a bathtub. And how many without any of those?
6,000.
More.
10,000.
More.
25,000. 23.
More.
23,270.
A lot more. 30,624 apartments had nothing. Okay?
How do they know that?
What?
How do they know that?
I don't exactly know. I would assume that they have deeds to where the area where they were.
They have records.
They would have property records. They wouldn't necessarily know specifically where the Jews are. Also, if you assume that the Jews had to do a census, and I assume that they had to ask for a census about who had running water, who had clean water. So I think that might come up from there also. Right? Okay. The Warsaw Ghetto was sealed November 16th. Okay. It had a high brick wall topped with broken glass because the Germans were very friendly. And the Jews had to actually pay for the construction of the wall. Okay. What? The Germans, yeah. I think they made the Jews build it, but the Germans made them build it as opposed to getting the Jews to build it by themselves. So how many people were confined in the Warsaw Ghetto?
543,000.
Okay, so less. So since so many people kept dying.
450,000.
It peaked at 445,000 in May 1941. So at this point in time, it was 30% of the, well, not at this point. Originally, they put a population of 30% of the city. They put 30% of the population of the city into 2% of the city's area. Okay? Yes.
Bigger than you.
Since you guys like using the metric system, in March 1941, it's estimated that there was a population density of 1,309 people per 100 square meters. Okay, with an average of 7.2 people sharing a room. Okay,
How many beds were there?
I would assume probably closer to none. I'd say maybe one. I'd say the richer people would have two,
How many years
but
was
probably
it like that?
what?
How many years was the ghetto for?
They were in the Warsaw Ghetto until late 1943. That's one of the later ones. Right? The Warsaw Ghetto uprising is in 1943.
Most people out there? Most people.
They killed most people by then. Yes, that's correct. Correct. Correct.
Getting bigger, like multiplying babies.
So that's the thing. So it actually started.
You can't even have brother?
So the birth rate did not outstrip the death rate, but what happened was they started moving Jews in from other places. So it did actually get more. The truth is that the person who said this said that the average of 7.2 people is actually, a lot of the time, was less than what actually was true. And that sometimes you could have anywhere between 25 and 30 people sharing a room. What? The Warsaw Ghetto. The daily food allocation was 200 calories a day. Do you know how many calories they say is normal? At least. At least, no.
2,000 calorie diet is a low amount.
Yeah. But I don't think you really need to exceed it. You can survive on that. Anyway, it was 200. Okay? And the Germans forbid fresh fruits, vegetables, meat, fish, or milk. Boiled potato skins in water apparently was a popular diet. But you have to remember, there was black marketeering, so people did get this stuff, but again, it wasn't predominantly so. And the poorer people obviously suffered the most. But I think that is where we will stop for now.